My name is Steve Pearson. I'm a friend of Pastor Remmel, and he has asked me to share some thoughts and findings from a study I did approximately 20 years ago in Estonia. I was working on my doctorate at the time, and my professor and I felt that this would be a very good subject to pursue and to um, find some evidence, find some testimonies, and to organize these into findings that then maybe could be considered by the worldwide church at large. Um, the title of the study became something that one of the people I interviewed gave me, actually, just said we sang ourselves free. And by that, this particular person meant free from sin, free from slavery to sin, but also free from Soviet domination. It had kind of a double meaning to it. We looked at it as the developmental aspect of musical involvement, participation in music, particularly singing, and how that affects people, how it helps in their development as Christians and as human beings, how it aids in understanding not only the aspects of the kingdom of God and the Word of God, but also in many areas of just general knowledge and learning. Okay, I'm going to talk about also what it was like during the years of repression, the 50 years or more of Soviet domination, because that's where most of my people that I interviewed were very familiar with. 20 years ago, Estonia had not been independent that long, and so there were very fresh memories of what had happened during the Soviet time. And I myself was there during the Soviet time as well. I remember some of that. So we'll go on. I'll just walk through this. And I've given this many times at the graduate school level, at both Wheaton College Graduate School, also Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, or Trinity International University as it's called now, and many other places, secular and Christian, with quite a bit of intrigue and quite a bit of interest in the subject, because it has not really been approached like this very often in the world of academics. Mostly musicologists or people who study music study the music. They look at how a composer works with harmonies, what is characteristic of the melodies, things like that. Looking for things like folk music and ethnomusicology or other types of very musical aspects. What this study is looking at is how music works in a society, in a group of people, as an organized effort. And so it's more in the world of sociology, and quite frankly, it's actually called the sociology of music. And it's a very overlooked aspect of music and how music works. Okay, for many of my people that I talk to, they don't know where Estonia is, I'm sorry to say. So I explain this, as you can see on this particular slide, that you're very, very close to Finland, for example, and very close, of course, sharing a border with Russia and Latvia. The reason for this study came from students that we had at the Nordic Bible Institute in Sweden, where my wife and I served for nearly 20 years. We taught there, we did administration there, and as things began to become more liberated inside the Soviet Union, students from the Baltic countries, notably Estonia and Latvia, but also Poland, began to show interest in coming to our school and studying. You may recognize some of these people, but these were our first 4 students from Estonia. Kirsti on the left, Margit next to her, Ellery, and then Mehis Metsala, whom I'm sure you probably have heard of if you don't know him personally. I was astounded and very impressed by their musicality, particularly compared to the Swedish scene and Swedish music, particularly church music. The high level of training for even people who were not music majors or simply had relatively little training, showed a great deal of ability in basic areas of music that are considered important as foundational and fundamental in understanding what music is. So this was the beginning of my interest, was way back in the early 90s. This would take form and take shape as a research project in the later 90s. Okay, now I don't need to remind you about Tallinn and what it looks like, but for the people I show this to, they've never seen anything like this. And you can see this is an older picture of particularly Olavisti Church. Has not been refurbished at this particular point. And I just show a few pictures of town. Here's a newer picture, of course, and of the town hall square, and so on. And also the music that is very active in the churches have a very high quality. This is something rather unfamiliar in this part of the world, particularly in the western areas, and particularly in the United States, where quality of music is often overlooked for other aspects. Other aspects might be popularity, or that it will appeal to a certain group of people that we are trying to reach for the gospel. Something other than music values or music quality, or some things that trained musicians would be interested in. But in Estonia, the situation, of course, is very, very high quality. It seemed to be no matter where you went, and I took my horn, I play the French horn all over the country at one point, and had no trouble whatsoever finding people who could accompany me on the piano quite well, very well in fact, much to my surprise. It didn't seem to matter if I was in Tallinn or Tartu or, well, almost anywhere. So going on, also the involvement of music for all ages of people was something we found early on, that there were mandolin choirs, as you see here, or even singing choirs, all kinds of choirs that were organized in churches. Also, I don't know if they're still going, but the Gloria Choir was a very excellent representation of the Estonian style of singing, which is quite different than the American style or even the Swedish style. Very, very different. Much more precise, much smaller sound, much more delicate sound, much more precise sound. And of course, your song festivals, which this is the one I attended in 1999. Enormously impressive. I walked probably 30 minutes to the back to get this photograph, but of all the people on stage, thousands, 30,000 something people on stage, the fire that's lit indicating a special event or special ceremony, and the sheer number of people, as many as 100,000, in some cases many more than that, maybe several 100,000, at some cases in the past, in the not so distant past. Okay, the first step in doing research like this is to write out your concern. What are you looking for? What is your interest in this particular phenomenon that you're going to look at? And this I had to write out. It had to do with music and Christian development. In other words, growing as a Christian. What role did music play, or does music play, in our Christian growth as far as the Estonian people are concerned? I have my notes here. I'll have to be turning a page, so please bear with me. Okay, looking also to a contrast between the Western style of music, if you will, involvement in churches, and looking at also Western Christian music and Western music in general. What are the differences? What do people point out as unique to Estonia or states that have formerly been under the Soviet umbrella, if you will? What role does music have? Is that different than the role that we have in America and in the other parts of the Western world? Also, the purpose then is to gather then information in a systematic and organized way, to study the data from people, getting this information from people who actually know something about this topic. I don't know about this topic, but there are, of course, many people in Estonia who are very, very not only up to date, very familiar and very articulate about this phenomenon. My goal was to find those people and then to interview those people in a systematic manner that I could then analyze later. Okay, that comes down to theoretical background. Okay, has this been done before? If so, by who, where? Okay, so I'm looking for, if you will, a book, books, studies, articles, dissertations, where this whole aspect of music and society has been covered before. Max Weber wrote a very good theoretical book on the sociology of music. Max Weber, of course, was a German social scientist. He is often called the inventor of sociology. He was the son of a minister and extraordinarily brilliant, particularly in pulling things together and seeing the big picture of the development of Western society. He looked at music as part of this development and as reflective of this development in very unique ways, very interesting ways, very interesting study. Theodor Adorno comes along a bit later. He's German, part of the Marxist Frankfurt Critical School. He had a lot of thoughts about music and economics, as you might expect from a Marxist, and the use of art in the development, not only politically, but sociologically of a group of people. Peter Martin has written a recent book called Sounds in Society. He is English. This particular book takes up the different theories of the sociology of music. He himself is not a musician that I know of. He is a sociologist, but this is his primary area of interest. There have been several case studies, one by Maria McCarthy. This had to do with Irish solo song singing in occupied Ireland. When England occupied Ireland, the solo song became more or less a way of resisting the English cultural advancement, if you will, or the attempt by the English to take over Ireland culturally, which they, of course, did not. And the solo song played, as Maria McCarthy points out, a role in that resistance. Another, Yilla Flam, is this case study of Jews who were entrapped and imprisoned in ghettos in Poland in World War II. And these people made songs and poetry. They composed songs and wrote poetry that they sang and recited to each other. And it kept them alive. It kept them with hope. It became essential in surviving another day, as they put it. However, these people, once that period of time was over, these people were not terribly interested in revisiting those songs or singing those songs for the researcher. They finally did, but it took some persuasion. They looked at it as something very special for a very special and terrible time that worked in a very special way, but it is not for a normal time, if you will. Going on, there was a man named Philip who was a researcher into Moravian letters. And as you know, the Moravians came to your country in the 1730s and were very impressed by the singing of the peasants, the Estonian-speaking peasants, who were already there, and how the gospel spread from place to place, not through preaching, as we normally would think, but through singing. How this exactly worked, I'm not sure, but at any rate, this was the testimony of these letters. They were written by Moravians to Zinzendorf back at Herrnhut, and I think at one point Zinzendorf actually came to Olaviste Church and preached several sermons, if I'm not mistaken. Pastor Remmel probably knows more about the history of that than I do. Going on, we have Iliade. Mircea Iliade was a Romanian researcher who worked at the University of Chicago. His interest has to do with myth. And myth, by myth, we mean a sacred, eternal, cosmic story. Myth is not fairy tale. That's for storybooks and that's for popular media. In the world of research, myth is very, very important. And a country or a people's myth is often a story that everybody can relate to or connect to in some way. Music, of course, can be very mythical. We have many examples of that. Most notably, I think, Wagner in his ring cycle. It's highly mythical, as well as Parsifal. Both of these have some Christian elements in them. For example, the idea of redemption being very strong in both of these, and the whole world of Christian mysticism in the Middle Ages being very prominent in Parsifal. These are mythical stories. They give us great values through story form. They tell us a great story that we know about and that we relate to as people. Iliad and Ganem, both of them, looking at sacred events and mythical metaphors and cultural metaphors. Certainly, I think the Song Festival would be a metaphor in many ways for the Estonian culture and the Estonian people. People relating to it in different ways. And this is one of the aspects that came out in the research. Max Weber, then, I'm just going to go over this very quickly. Max Weber wrote a book on the sociology of music and related it to general social theory. He talked about the rationalization of Western life. In other words, going from the Middle Ages into the modern age, there is a general tendency towards rationalizing, or if you will, looking at things more and more on a scientific level of very austere and strong realism, if you want to look at that philosophically, in the philosophical sense of the terms. The notation system, for example, is a way of rationalizing or creating a rational way of writing down a representation of music so that another person can take this, read it, and reproduce that music. It's a way of, if you will, storing information that is readable somewhere else. So somebody could write a piece in Italy and then people could perform that piece in Belgium having never heard it before. So this is something that, I'm not saying it's unique to the West, but it's very strong in Western music. The idea of being able to write it down. Going on, the equal tempered scale. This is much more complex. I won't get into the mathematics of this, but the scale that we have on a piano is generally called an equal tempered scale or a well-tempered scale. However, it's not mathematically perfect. It is not based, and by that in musical terms, I mean it's not based on a mathematically perfect fifth or perfect fourth. These have been altered somewhat so that the piano can be tuned in such a way as to be able to play reasonably well in every key. If it was tuned in a different way, in a more, if you will, theoretical way that goes back to the ancient Greeks, this would not be possible. However, if you look at a violin, which does not have a fixed pitched system, then the violin, of course, can make the small alterations in pitch that are required using what we call a Pythagorean system. So the well-tempered scale is a compromise. And it's a compromise for the sake, if you will, of effectiveness, efficiency. And this is a big thing in Western thought, is how efficient is something? Are we willing to compromise something for the sake of its efficiency? And quite frankly, we are. We're very well willing to do that. By the way, it's Johann Sebastian Bach who discovered how to tune the equal tempered scale. He knew the mathematics, he didn't know how to tune it, and he discovered it during his time at Curtin, which is in the early 1720s. The Western harmonic system then is built on the well-tempered scale, the equal tempered scale, and that is very rational. It's a highly theoretical thing to study. I'm sure that some of you who are listening to this have studied Western harmony. As you know, it's very technical. It's not an easy subject, and it has its rules and it has its way of doing things. Going on, the symphony orchestra is another example of rationalization in the West, and this would be everybody playing the same pitch system, the same piece of music at the same tempo, following one great leader, one conductor. And as Gannon says, this is a cultural metaphor of the country of Germany. It's really a quite good one, in that you have a leader, if you will, who is conducting, but everybody has their part and everybody fits in with their particular instrument and their particular time, and it depends a lot on the skill of the instrumentalists in order to be able to do this well and to make an entire piece of music. So this is also only possible through a great emphasis on rationalization or a rational approach to music. Adorno is more political, and he looks at the sociology of music as applied to political aspects, society, and economics. You might expect this from him. He looked at true art as that which resists enslavement to any political system. In other words, true art has a dialectic function, and those of you who studied philosophy, Hegel, and even Marx know about the dialectic, where you have thesis, antithesis. Well, the dialectic for music would be the antithesis, would be that which opposes propaganda, which opposes repression, and points out, if you will, repressive tendencies in the ruling power, and then attempts to initiate change. We've seen that in our own country, in America, at certain times, but I think especially in the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, we did see music used in that way. Most notably, I think, at the festival at Woodstock, which you may have heard of. He looked at freedom of true expression, that there should be unlimited as far as this is concerned, that there should be the freedom to express oneself. And he also looked at, he was very critical of propaganda music. Now, he defined propaganda music as music which supports the status quo. Now, that status quo could be political, and many people think the word propaganda applies only to politics, but in fact, in research, it does not. It can have to do anything with anything that's a status quo, a way of doing things which will inevitably repress certain people. Western popular music, for example, supports the status quo of the big marketing machine of music. In other words, an industry that makes money. This is what it's interested in, to create music that is a commodity that makes money. And unfortunately, this is true in the Christian world as well. There is music that is being created for the sole purpose of making money under the, if you will, the rubric or the title of Christian music. Western pop music was created with this in mind. Make no mistake about it, it was. It was created and controlled, not created maybe so much, but controlled by businessmen and not by musicians. And many musicians who were great musicians refused to have anything to do with that. I can give you two names, one Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw, who were dance band, jazz band, swing band leaders in the 1930s. He looked at music that's created only for profit as consumerism, as cultural consumerism, and he's really quite negative on this. He also looked at it as a culture industry, which is constantly cranking out, if you will, creating, just like an assembly line creates cars, pieces of music come out sounding remarkably the same or remarkably similar for the sole sake of selling them. And he looked at this whole thing as vulgar because it's a waste of talent, a waste of gift, a waste, if you will, of very gifted and capable musicians for the sake of money, for the sake of usually money for somebody else. So this has changed somewhat, I have to say, through YouTube and other more personal ways of marketing one's own personal creations. This has changed somewhat. You don't have to go through the industry. You don't have to go through the big company as much as was necessary at one point in time. Peter Martin talks about attitudes or socialization of music and values and attitudes, that it's simply a phenomena of culture. And he points out that music attitudes, music values are picked up. They're not consciously taught. They're picked up as a person grows up. As you know, when we are small, we learn a language not by going to school and sitting in class, but simply by learning it. It's something that happens to normal people. They learn a language. You learn Estonian very quickly. By the time you're 3 or 4 years old, you speak it perfectly. me as an adult, I'd have a very, very difficult time doing that in 3 or 4 years. And even then, I would not speak it perfectly. So it's something that happens to us when our learning capacity is at full, if you will, to its full strength, that we can learn a language. Well, we also can learn music, and we get an idea of what kind of music we like and what we relate to, largely through the society we live in, our parents, our friends, our brothers and sisters, and so on. And we come to feel that that is our music, and all other music is really something else. It's not as good. When we start putting the labels good and bad on things, then we are really making a value judgment. So this is a normal thing, if you will. My music that I enjoy is something that I've learned over years. It'd be very different than tribesmen in Central African Republic and what they have learned and what they enjoy and how they use their music. And it would not relate to me at all, and neither would my music relate to them at all. So it's an interesting phenomenon. It's not a universal, if you will, set of rhythms or pitches that mean the same thing to everybody, no matter where they are in the world. As much as we would like it to be that, it is not that. Now, if you talk to a linguist, they will tell you there are deep structures in language. That is true. There are deep structures, certain things that are found in all languages at a certain level, but in music that does not seem to be true, at least not at this point in the research. No matter how bad some people would like it to be true, it just simply hasn't been found. Okay, we're going to take a look. I'm just going to talk about these case studies where music was a means of preserving and supporting an ethnic identity, strengthening that during times of repression, times of very difficult, where people were threatened by an outside force. Irish under English occupation, the Jewish ghetto I've talked about before. Philip, we've talked about this, the Moravians in Livonia in the 1700s, and the skillful singing. This is something that we've looked at just for a minute before. All right, this leads me to questions. Now, you have to write some questions to give yourself structure in a research project like this. You can't just go out and ask random questions. You have to have a structure so that people are generally talking about the same thing. So I came up with 4 or 5 different questions here. And these are not the questions that you give to people to answer. These are questions I'm trying to answer myself. The first one here is, in what ways and to what extent does music reveal, illustrate, and relate to the cultural and religious identity of Estonian Christians? Okay, so in what ways, how does it work, and to what extent? How far does it work? How much does it work? Okay, going on, the next one, in what ways and to what extent does music support and develop this identity? In other words, the educational aspect, the learning aspect. How does music work in that? Finally, what changes are occurring in the music of local Estonian churches since independence, since 1991? And in what ways and to what extent are these changes affecting Estonian Christianity, in particular concepts and expressions of Estonian Christian identity? Okay, and then finally there's a demographic. Demographic means how old are you, where do you live, are you male, female, or whatever. In all evident variables, in other words, do I live in Tallinn, do I live in somewhere else, are there systematic differences? In other words, are there identifiable, consistent differences between the responses of subjects with respect to age, function, church, education, geographic location, and so on. Okay, so some choices then. I'm going to have to do this in this way. There's certain type of research that we call social science descriptive research. It's based on interviewing people, writing down what they say, and then analyzing that and combining statements that are generally about the same subject. We call this descriptive research, or an ethnography or an ethnographic case study. There's lots of books written on this. It's a very good way to do research to get a general idea. It also requires that I write some more questions and a protocol, which are the questions I give to the people, and then I do an ethnographic analysis. Now, thankfully, we have computers today where I can write out the answers and systematically go through those and combine answers from different people about the same subject and see if those answers are consistent. Okay, some practical steps then. I need organization to plan and schedule interviews. I need 24 subjects we decided on, 24 different people, and we took 12 from Tallinn and 12 from outside of Tallinn. We took a selection of pastors, of musicians, and we took an even selection of men and women as well. We had to hire research assistants. I had grant money for this, and that became Margit Sepp and Mehis Metsola. So then we recorded the interviews on tape. Back then we had cassette tapes, and we could record an interview, and then we transcribed each interview by transcribing it to written form using a small computer. All right, so Mehis was one of my research assistants. Here he is in his home where he grew up, which is near downtown Tallinn, and finally Margit as well, who was also one of our students at the Nordic Bible Institute, and who's also taught, I believe, Hebrew and Greek and theology at the Methodist Seminary. Some of the results. The summation for numbers 1 and 2, I just simply put these results in the order of the questions. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you or bother you with that, but I'm going to just take a look at this. One thing that came out was that music in Estonia, in Estonian Christianity, is regarded as the first pulpit. We would never say that in America. We would say preaching is the first pulpit. Preaching is the primary source of inspiration, information, and, if you will, challenge to our Christian lives. But it came out very consistently in the interviews that Estonians regard the first pulpit as being music, not preaching. Preaching is secondary. And participation in music develops the following different qualities and aspects of the Christian life. Now you can read through these. I'll send this PowerPoint along to Pastor Rimmel and he can show this to you. This is astounding. This is a Christian educator's gold mine, if you will. When you start talking about these things, you start talking about a mature Christian community that's able to function well with other Christians and with the outside world. So unity, joy, identity, courage, community, purification, problem solving, resolution of doubt, development of convictions, amplification of truth, integration of truth, aid in recall, broaden perspective, aid in learning theology, essential in worship, and essential in relating to God. This is a wonderful thing to think about, a wonderful way of if you will, approaching not only worship, but the whole the educational aspects of worship and what we learn, how we grow, how we develop as Christians through worship services, through primarily singing. Some other changes that have happened, I found that people were generally unprepared 20 years ago for the independence. It came rather suddenly. I remember it very well when the Soviet Union fell. It was very sudden. It was very surprising when the Berlin Wall fell and then the Soviet Union kind of just fell apart. People weren't really very prepared for it, especially economically, but in other ways as well. It became a lot of financial pressure on people, and with that, music activities were somewhat lessened because of the time constrictions. There also started a whole world of commercialization. There was a commercial interest that came to Estonia. Before, during the Soviet Union, commercialism was really kind of a bad word. And making money was not something that somebody would like to do in the Soviets. But with the independence coming, then the door was open for, if you will, financial investments and also for economic development, but with that came commercialization of music as well. So this was looked upon as threatening by many people to the Estonian way of life and also to music. And also this happened. People were anxious about making it financially. Where is this going to go? We can't afford to live here. We can't afford to live. I'm working 3 jobs and we're still not making it. This was true in the 1990s. And this general overall concept of peace and valued, treasured, um, if you will, value of peace, both between other people and inside oneself, was taken over by conflict and anxiety. I want to say also competition became part of the mix. So some conclusions. Certainly your song festival is a very strong metaphor of who you are as people. There is a culturally shared value of peace. This came out again and again. In America, we don't think that. Okay, we like liberty here. If you say this word, liberty, that's a big word. That's a powerful word. That is never a wrong word to say, or very seldom a wrong word to say. In Estonia or even in Sweden, liberty is not as important as it is in America. We seem to think in America that it's very important for everybody everywhere in the world. That's not necessarily true. I think Americans fall short a little bit there. But liberty is a big deal here, but peace is a big deal in Estonia. In Sweden, by the way, it's equality. Equality is the big value. Music and repression then. Music and repression and Adorno and Estonian Christian music. Music and repression. Music is extremely valuable, I want to say, weapon in oppression. When people are being repressed or oppressed by an outside force, music becomes very, very strong as a unifying force, as a force of resistance. This has been true for many, many years, many centuries, but was particularly shown in your case, in the Estonian world, to be extraordinarily powerful. The singing revolution, the 1989 Song Festival, and later on, the cessation from the Soviet Union. These are powerful, powerful elements. And by the way, the separation of Estonia from the Soviet Union was completely nonviolent. Not one person was recorded to have ever been injured or hospitalized in any way during that whole sequence of events that I remember very well, 1991, and it was completely peaceful. Now, Adorno in Estonian Christian music, I think he would look at Estonian Christian music during the Soviet period as fulfilling the true role of art, as art was meant to be, of resisting oppression, as being that catalyst, that tool, that great, if you will, reservoir of not only faith but thought and belief that resists what's trying to be pushed on people. Our telephone rang. Hang on just a second. Sorry, we'll just keep going here. He would look at that as resisting that and therefore fulfilling its true purpose. Okay, some other implications here. Western Christian music, unfortunately, has gone the other direction. It does not. Has gone the other direction. It has been, in other words, more commercialized. That the commercial interest, the amount of money, how popular it is, how much royalty can you get. This becomes the primary interest, not the maintenance of my cultural identity or anything like that, but rather how much money can we make. This is becoming true more and more in Western Christian music. This trend has continued for several decades now. For Christian ministry then, evangelism and Christian formation, I think for people in Estonia, this is absolutely essential to understand the role of music and to be very aware. So people who are coming over from our country or other countries to work in Estonia, I think it would be very wise for them to study the Song Festival movement and the whole world of music in Estonia, and particularly the great Estonian composers and musicians, Kirlios Krek and Arvo Pärt, of course, are world famous, world class, world respected musicians from Estonia. For missiology, this is much the same as I just mentioned. Missiology, the study of missions, the study of cross-cultural ministry. And then teaching and learning, something that we don't do much in America. We don't bring in the arts of any kind. particularly music, into learning. We look at learning as highly behavioral. In other words, grounded on the world of behaviorism and the philosophy of behaviorism. Um, you've shown the world that it's not that way at all. It can be a much better way, a much more thorough and engaging way through music. And I think that's extremely valuable. Okay, some implications for Estonia then. There is a move towards Western capitalism. Of course, that move has continued for many years now. But also with that move is the decline, the general overall decline of the Estonian singing culture. I haven't been there in some time now, so I am unaware as far as where this stands right now. But in the late 1990s, this was already apparent and being talked about. And as far as the Estonian church goes in this, one of your leaders, and I'm sure you know who he is, but I won't mention his name, talked about the church as a place to preserve the singing culture of Estonia. He looked at it as a refuge from the demands of change, and to quote him, he said it was a harbor from the world, the harbor from the anxiety and the competition and the conflict that, if you will, this Western market-oriented Western economic model gives, but rather a quiet meditative place, as he put, where singing is preserved. And I think it's extremely wise, if you will, not only a place where you can hear the gospel, but you can hear what it means to be an Estonian Christian, and the heritage, the connection with the past, now 300 years of Christianity in Estonia, which is extremely important. We can connect not only with each other, but with those who have gone before us. Okay, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity of sharing with you. I'd love to see you at some point in time. We hope to get there. Right now we have family responsibilities that keep us fairly close to our home and not able to travel as much as we would like, but we hope in the near future that we will be able to get back to Europe, and we will definitely get to Estonia. Thank you very much, and again, I will send this PowerPoint along to Pastor Remmel, and he can show it and answer questions. If you'd like to contact me on Skype, for example, during the conference and have question and answer session, that also might be able to be arranged, and I would look forward to that. Thank you, and may God bless you richly.